"Tonight I will sleep with my concubine," said the prince to her on their wedding night. Candlelight, braided with smoke and perfume until the air itself felt ceremonial. The palace shone as if polished by 1,000 hands and 2 centuries of expectation. The mirrors did not just reflect, they multiplied judgment. Every glance seemed to have a twin across the gallery. Every whisper found a corridor to slip down and return sharpened. Madeleine kept her spine straight and her breathing silent. The lace at her throat scratched like a nettle and smelled faintly of starch. She could feel a faint tremor in her knees that she would not let show. They had taught her the steps, the bows, the angles of the head, the measured smile that did not reveal uneven teeth or country nerves. She executed each as if she had practiced them all her life. The prince stood beside her like a portrait that had come to life. He wore control the way other men wore velvet. His gaze scanned the room as if it were a ledger he alone could calculate. When he looked at her, it was a glance, a courtesy, not a question, not an invitation. She returned the look with the poise of a woman who had learned to carry heavy baskets in silence at the same time. Latin rose and fell like sea swell from the chapel, spilled out into the galleries, and was caught in the folds of brocade. The priest's voice blurred into the scrape of chair legs and the creak of a fan. A ring slid over her knuckle, cool as coin. Fingers brushed. His skin was warm and dry. His hand withdrew, as if burned by being seen. They turned to the court. There was applause as soft as rain. Bows and curtsies thinned the distance without bridging it. The queen's women floated in a cloud of powder and approval and arranged her veil with tiny, precise tugs that meant, "Hold still. Smile. Do not blink too much." Her heart beat against the whalebone cage, stubborn and loud. Supper unfurled in courses that glowed and vanished, interrupted by toasts that felt like a pageant performed for the benefit of those who would never taste the oranges or the capon. Musicians worked their bows until the strings sang. She took tiny bites, then folded her hands and listened to the hum that lived under the music, the measuring hum of ambition and aligned advantage. The prince spoke to a secretary, to an ambassador, to a man whose ribbon marked him as a minister without portfolio. He did not ask if the pheasant was to her taste. He did not ask if the candles bothered her eyes. He did not need to. When it was time, a procession formed so smooth it felt rehearsed by the building itself. Torches moved like stars unscrewed from the firmament and brought indoors. The queen's women led with their murmurs. A priest whispered a blessing at the threshold of the marital suite, as if he feared to wake the house's old ghosts. The door to the antechamber closed on the salt-bright applause, and the hush that followed was so complete she could hear the tick of the bracket clock and her own breathing. The bed was a field of silk and embroidery, heavy with expectation. A fire burned low and steady. The prince dismissed the servants with a gesture so small she almost missed it. The final pair of hands smoothed the coverlet and withdrew with faces blanked by training. The last latch clicked. The silence that remained belonged to no one but them. He did not come closer. Madeleine kept her hands folded. She did not go to the bed. She could not pretend the scene into something warm. The prince turned his ring once and looked not at her, but at a point over her shoulder, as if speaking to a duty that stood in her place. "Tonight I will sleep with my concubine." The words were level, crisp, and brittle as winter. They cut with the tidiness of a knife used for trimming roses. Her mouth opened, then closed. She swallowed the lamplight and the sting of perfume. Her voice, when she found it, surprised her by not breaking. "Then enjoy your rest, Your Highness. It is a long day to end upon." He studied her then, as if recalculating. He nodded once. It was not apology. It was acknowledgement. He turned and walked toward the door that led to his own set of rooms, each with their own antechambers and guards and secrets. His steps made no sound on the carpet. She did not follow. She did not call him back. She remained where he had left her, halfway between threshold and bed, suspended between a vow spoken under Latin and a night that had been told what it would be. When the door closed, she exhaled. The room was beautiful in a way designed to instruct awe. The ceiling painted with gods who had never known hunger. The curtain tassels tied in knots so intricate they suggested meanings no one would explain. She looked at the bed again. It looked back like a stage. She refused to debut on it as a silent prop. From beneath the bodice, she drew out the narrow strip of ribbon she had smuggled through the day. The color was the exact violet of grapes at dusk, the harvest shade that stained fingers and teeth and stayed a while no matter how hard one scrubbed. She crossed the room and tied it in a simple plain knot to the bedpost. The silk did not match the opulence. It didn't need to. It made its own claim. For remembering, she whispered to the empty bed, and the empty bed did not answer. Music drifted through the doors like memory. Laughter followed, polished and high. Somewhere, a man coughed. Somewhere else, a woman hushed him with the authority of a fan. The bracket clock marked the minute she stood there, and the next as if counting things mattered. She straightened her shoulders and went to the small valet table. The combs there were silver instead of wood. The water smelled faintly of rose rather than soap. She dipped her fingers in and let the cold pull heat from her skin until her pulse slowed. The mirror above the table showed a woman with too much lace at her throat and eyes that would not dull. She could stay in the room and be the story. She could be found in the morning pale and still and generous with smiles while the court sorted what kind of humiliation pleased it most. Or she could make herself the witness. She slipped her feet into soft-soled slippers so that her steps would be a rumor rather than a declaration. She opened the door not to the corridor the court used, but to the narrow back stair the women had shown her earlier with a wink and a warning. If you must escape, escape without being seen escaping. The stair smelled like beeswax and old linen. It wound down into a corridor lined with locked closets and plain doors that servants used a dozen times each day to keep the palace fed and dressed and shining. She moved like a person who belonged. That was the key she had learned in her first hour inside these walls. Not to scurry, not to flinch, to move as if someone had told you where to be. A pair of footmen passed with a silver tray and a jug of wine that caught the light and threw it back. They stepped aside without thinking. She inclined her head the exact measure that did not ask permission and did not extend thanks. A maid opened a linen press and measured her with eyes seasoned by observation. The girl looked away when Madeleine did not alter her pace. The corridor widened and poured her into a smaller gallery. Portraits watched from their gilded frames with the disinterest of the dead. The waxed floor gleamed. A draught she did not create lifted the hair at the back of her neck. She had gone this way earlier in ceremony, following the prince and the court in an order set by birth and title. Now she reversed the direction and paid attention to where tapestries gently stirred when there was no one near them, where a door latch had a burr that a gloved hand might catch. She paused at a mirror set in an angle that let her see around the corner without showing herself. Light pooled like white wine. Figures moved past, their reflections slipping over the glass in a way that made truth momentary and deception easy. Two faces resolved that she recognized by reputation rather than acquaintance. The concubine walked with a self-possession that had cost her. Her hair was arranged to look unconsidered and had clearly been considered by the best hands in Paris. To the side, not touching, walked the prince. He was not smiling and not frowning. He had perfected the face that revealed nothing and thus invited everything. Madeleine did not step out. She did not knock. She let the reflection bring them to her without wanting to be known to it. They turned through a half-open door into a small salon she had noticed earlier because the books there were ledgers rather than poetry, and because the candles there always seemed new. The air changed when they crossed the threshold, not warmer, not cooler, just quieter. The quiet that happens when people intend to be overheard and use the silence as decoration. She followed to the door and listened. The carpet inside swallowed sound. The prince did not raise his voice. The concubine spoke in that polished tone created when danger meets practice. If anyone had pressed an ear to the panel, they would have heard a conversation worthy of a scandal sheet. If anyone had watched, as Madeleine did through the small sliver of mirror fleck caught between the hinge and the jamb, they would have seen not the hurry of lust, but the staging of it. The concubine tilted her head with an angle too precise. The prince's hand rested on the back of a chair rather than on her. He stood a fraction too far away. He leaned in a breath too late. It was a duet of misdirection, a scene designed to be seen. Madeleine's throat tightened. Even in falsehood, the ache of what was being used rang true. That ache did not dilute her clarity. It sharpened it. A paper slipped from the inside of the concubine's sleeve when she turned. It slid, flirted with the air, and settled beneath the lip of a small table. No one inside noticed. The prince had moved to the mantel and examined a clock as if its innards could explain any of this. The concubine adjusted her lace with the detachment of someone who would not be allowed to rest until every eye was satisfied. Madeleine slid through the open door like a note where the music demanded one. She bent, her hand closing over the paper, her body a screen between her theft and the people whose actions had created the opportunity. The sheet was smooth, thick, the kind used for accounts that mattered. A broken wafer of wax clung to one corner. The impressed mark was not the great seal that certified treaties. It was a secondary device she had seen on orders that arranged household and city business, the kind that never made it into painted records and always made their way into lives. She did not unfold it there. She tucked it into the inside of her bodice, where the heat of her skin could soften the wax and make the sheet curve to her. Her heart knocked against it, as if trying to read what was written through touch alone. Her gaze moved once more to the players beyond. The concubine had shifted, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. Not in the mirror, not in the lag of glass, but directly. A flicker, a question, a tiny recognition of another woman standing well within the circle of danger. The concubine's lashes lowered by a fraction that could be mistake or flattery or warning. The prince's hand moved to the edge of the mantel and stilled in a way that suggested he had noticed the shift in air, but not its cause. Madeleine withdrew as she had entered. Not a flinch, not a stumble. She reached the corridor with the same deliberate pace with which she had crossing the gallery after the Latin vows. Once there, she leaned briefly against the chill of the stone. It steadied her, like vines tied to a trellis against wind. The paper warmed against her skin. She did not allow herself to run. Running would ruin everything. Running would announce she had something to run with. She retraced her steps toward the small back stair that would spill her into the safer anonymity of the antechamber. She would hide the paper, tie her ribbon tighter, and think with the door locked. She would do that. The plan felt clean in her mind. It held. She stepped into the little passage that opened onto the salon again, but which led, if she turned right and not left, toward the servant door she had used before. The hallway there was not empty. The air tightened in a different way, the way a music room's air tightens when a bow pauses above a string. Footsteps approached. Not the scuff of tired feet, not the rush of a messenger. Measured steps, certain as a metronome. Someone accustomed to rooms open as a right. Someone who had never asked permission to enter any door in this house. The hair along her arms rose in a prickly wave. Her fingers folded into her skirt, pressing the fabric to keep them from reaching instinctively over her heart to check the paper. She lifted her chin and set her shoulders, and became the new princess again in all the armor that title provided. Armor could be tailored. Armor could be walked in. The handle of the private salon began to turn. Lamplight shifted under the door in a bright blade. The sound of the latch releasing was very small and very final. Madeleine stepped back once, aligning herself with the shadow of the paneling so that if the eye swept, it would sweep over what it expected to see. The door swung inward. The door swung inward. A chamberlain stepped through with the ease of a man who belonged to every room. He carried a ledger, a snuffer, and the scent of wax. His gaze swept the salon and did not pause where a princess might have stood if she wished to be admired. "Your Highness," he said, because form required it. "Do you desire fresh candles?" Madeleine let the shadow of the paneling continue its work. She tipped her head by a hair. "The candles will do." He inclined without curiosity, crossed to a sconce, and pinched a flame to coax it brighter. The light rose obediently. He adjusted a chair by an inch, the way a man does when order is his faith, then withdrew with a soft click of the tongue to summon the footman outside. The door settled back into its frame. The private world inside resumed its pretense. She did not look toward the pair beyond the mantel. She did not give the chamberlain a reason to look again. She slipped along the wall, found the narrow door that led to the service corridor, and claimed it without haste. The passage smelled of soap and long hours. Her heart beat against the sheet hidden at her breast. She felt the pressure of wax against a rib, softening with her heat, taking the shape of her. Footsteps ahead. 2 scullions, with a tray of empty glasses. One boy glanced up, saw a silk hem and a steady face, and threw himself flat against the wall to give her room without knowing he did. She nodded once. She heard her mother's voice from another life. "Walk as though you were carrying a full pail and the road owed you." She walked like that. The servant's stare spiraled up and deposited her into an antechamber she recognized by the pattern of its carpet and the angle of its window. The sky beyond had shifted from black to a paler ink. She slipped inside her rooms, closed the door with her hand on the latch to dull the sound, and stood still until her breathing matched the clock. The bed's post waited with its knot of violet. She went to the dressing table instead. From the bottom of her jewel coffer, empty of jewels, she lifted a folded kerchief and slid the sheet beneath it. She pressed the lid closed and tested the hinge twice, as if a hinge could promise to keep a secret. She did not sleep. She lay on top of the covers and watched the light raising its veil in the window until the patterns on the rug learned to be themselves again. Somewhere above, a door creaked, and a woman's laugh leaked through, then died, as laughter does at dawn. A knock sounded before the day could be named. The Queen's women entered with their gentle authority. The one with the narrow eyes eyed the bed and the ribbon and said nothing. They brought warm water and a tray with a heel of bread and a small porcelain cup. The bread tasted of yeast and duty. The cup contained a cordial that pretended to be kindness and was, in fact, instruction. "Today begins with lessons, Your Highness," said the senior tutor, a woman whose fans were more eloquent than her mouth. "We will save you from embarrassment." "Or present me with the proper kind," Madeleine said, because humor could be armor if used precisely. A fan snapped shut, not unkindly. "We shall teach you how to make your enemies drown in their own politeness." Madeleine proceeded to drown in it herself for an hour. She learned again the geometry of curtsies, how to turn without showing the heel, how to receive praise you did not believe without letting the disbelief show. She was drilled on the names of men who expected to be remembered and those who ought to be forgotten while pretending otherwise. What does one do if a gentleman of lower birth refuses to bow sufficient to your rank? She measured her answer. One addresses him with warmth at a distance. Warmth implies magnanimity. Distance implies precedent. A flutter of approval, quiet but real. The tutor lifted a ringed hand. "You were not born to this, which means you may be better at it than those who were. They forget it is theatre. You will never forget." "They taught me vineyards are theatre too," Madeleine said. "Every hand must move on cue, or the harvest spoils." "Do not say that within earshot of men who think everything is their cue," the tutor murmured, and the women smiled with their eyes because the fans would not allow their mouths to. By the time the court prepared for the promenade, the light had settled into something Paris understood, silvery and suitable for mirrors. The mirrored gallery opened its length like a river. Courtiers stood along it in precise clusters that looked like spontaneity. The Queen's women steered Madeleine to the correct point on the bank. Face after face approached, offered pleasantries trimmed to the edge of insult, and receded. She responded with grace, organized like a ledger, what to spend, what to save. She moved a pace or two, then stopped to admire a tapestry that depicted vines so green they almost smeared the eye. The threads made grapes look easy to pluck. The prince entered the gallery at the far end, shoulders squared, expression in place. The air changed the way a room's air changes when a window opens. He moved through the necessary greetings with the elegance of a man who had had to become the role to survive it. A step to the left to receive an ambassador, a nod to a marshal of the court. He arrived beside her with the neat inevitability of tide. "Your Highness," he said, without turning his head. "You have not tripped yet." "Not all obstacles are on the floor," she replied, eyes on the tapestry. "Some are framed and hung at eye level." A small, almost hidden breath that might have been a laugh if laughing were permissible. "You have endured your mourning." "I made no enemies," she said. "Or rather, I made none today who were not already determined to exist. That is an accomplishment here. And you?" She let her gaze rise to the mirror, where his face and hers existed side by side, not touching. "Have you accomplished anything this morning besides being seen?" "I have been informed of 5 matters and decided none," he said, "which means the day is normal." She considered the reflection of that answer. "Then perhaps we are both ahead of expectation." He inclined his head. The movement was slight enough to be deniable. "Do not be alone when the gallery empties." "Because of gossip," she said, as if naming the weather. "Because of drafts," he said, and strode away, leaving behind a warning that could be read several ways. The concubine drifted into view like a ship whose sails know the wind better than the captain does. She did not look at Madeline directly. She turned her face to an arrangement of flowers, as if flowers could be learned by rote, and murmured to a lady-in-waiting, something that made 2 fans lift in tandem. The woman's profile was a study in poise provoked by necessity. Madeline felt heat gather in her throat and then recede. Like a blush, she managed to convince back into the skin. She nodded to a man of minor title who smiled at her with his teeth while his eyes offered sympathy as unrisky as rain behind glass. She swallowed the sympathy and moved on. When the promenade ended, she did not go to her rooms. She went to the library. The hour sat between day and evening long enough for the room to hold both. Light slanted across long tables and made dust motes look holy. The librarian had vanished in search of a key, or a story, or a family to feed. She chose a corner where the shelves half protected her, and drew the coffered kerchief from her sleeve. The sheet slid out with a sigh that felt too loud. She smoothed it with her palm and studied the hand. The numerals were precise and narrow, the flourishes disciplined. The spacing suggested a mind that distrusted ornament unless it argued for itself. She pulled a ledger from the nearest table to anchor the page. Household deliveries recorded in a tidy clerk's hand, names of merchants, dates, quantities. She scanned columns until a sequence recurred that matched the rhythm on her sheet. Not numbers corresponding to numbers corresponding to letters, if one knew where to look. The initial letter of each entry, the day number counted 3 by 3, the trailing tally's last digit stepped like a dancer counting to 8. She tried the first line with the ledger as her key. The numbers yielded a letter, then another. She wrote them in the margin of the kerchief, keeping her strokes small and clean the way she had learned to account for bottles and baskets without wasting paper. A draft purred at her neck. She turned and saw a seam where there had never been a seam before. Shelves did not align with the edge of the wall as they ought. A thin line of shadow suggested space beyond. The hidden panel breathed again, chill and secret. She remained where she was and listened. Nothing. No scuff. No whisper. The building exhaled and held. A rustle at the far end of the room, then the soft jingle of keys. A junior clerk entered, dusty and earnest, like a boy come to measure himself against different men's work. He nodded when he saw her rank, even as he tried to be invisible. "Your Highness," he said from a respectful distance. "May I assist?" "You already are," she said, and let her fingers rest on the ledger's spine. "This was the one I needed." He started to bow, caught himself, then bowed anyway as if the body could not help telling the truth. "There are other ledgers with the same hand, if that pleases you." "Not yet," she said. "For now, this one is enough." He touched the spine of a different book and pulled it halfway free, then returned it, as if to prove he belonged without pretending he owned. "Call if you wish the candles lit." "I will." When he left, the library absorbed the sound of his retreat. Madeline returned to the page and the pattern. The letters now made sense. A name began to surface in the margin like a watermark rising through paper. It did not belong to the prince. It did not belong to any of the gilded ornaments who spoke too much in the gallery. It belonged to the one man in the palace whose power was not borrowed. The First Minister. She touched the margin where the name had completed itself and let the knowledge fix under her skin. Her stomach tightened, and the sensation was not fear, not precisely. It was a tension concentrated to a point. She copied the letters again, smaller, certain, so that if anyone else read her little notes, they would have to know what to seek. Dusk settled deeper. The library's windows reflected more room than sky. She gathered the sheet, the kerchief, and the understanding she had just made, folded them into her sleeve, and stood. The chapel waited down a corridor and around a turning where footsteps sounded different, because the floor there was old stone instead of timber. She stepped into that quiet and felt how sound falls differently where prayer is the primary labor. A single servant kneeled by the side door and stood quickly when she entered, bowing himself into the lintel with a glance that begged absolution for existing. She gave him a smile as thin as a ribbon, and he vanished. Candles on iron spikes cast small suns that made shadows long. She chose a pew near the side, where a pillar could hide the movement of her hands. She spread the sheet and placed next to it a psalter, left by someone with notes in a tidy Latin script. Numbers to letters. Letters to syllables, syllables to the shape of policy and the path of influence. The pattern did not resist now that she had the key. The First Minister's signature did not sit at the bottom of the page where signatures belong. It was knitted into the lines themselves, as if the man had decided even his name should dictate how others read. The sweetness of wax and the faint acid of old smoke made a space she could think inside. She aligned one more sequence with the day's lection, where the initial letters of verses offered what she needed at intervals. Again the name rose. No ambiguity in the sequence, not rumor, not malice. Record. She closed the psalter and slid the sheet into her sleeve, then reconsidered and moved it higher, above the elbow where it would be harder to dislodge. She pressed her palm to it and felt the edges through linen. A presence leaned into the space the candles made. She sensed it before she heard it, the subtle change in air when another breath takes its share. The weight of a gaze that knows its weight. A shadow grew long across the flagstone and reached the edge of the pew where her hand rested, flattening her knuckles in pale light. She did not look up at once. She gathered the kerchief, smoothed it, and slipped it into the bodice. Her pulse was quick, but not wild. She set the psalter back in its place, as a woman would who had finished praying and now intended to leave with a quiet heart. A gloved hand settled on the rail, not quite touching hers. "You read too well, Your Highness." "You read too well, Your Highness." Etienne had not meant to speak, not at first. He had followed the draft that slid from the chapel like a thread, and it had led him to her. The candles lifted their thin gold and put it on her hands, on the neatness of the papers she had not been given to hold, on the sweep of her lashes when she did not yet look at him. The pew separated them by a foot of carved wood and by a chasm of choices that had not been his to make. She did not startle. She did not perform surprise for him or for the walls. She simply turned her face by a fraction and let her gaze climb to meet his. Her eyes were the color of the harvest she had been taken from, that late shade when fruit gathers dusk inside it. Then perhaps they should have taught me less, she said, and her voice was even, not small. He held himself still. A prince learns to be a wall when being a man could undo him. They will teach you only what is useful to them. And you, she said, which lesson do you recommend I forget first? The one that says you are safe if you are quiet. A beat of comprehension passed between them, like a chord picked out soft on a viol. It was too intimate, too dangerous. He made it colder. You were not expected here, he said, glancing past her shoulder to the iron spikes with their burning pearls. This is not a place for industrious thought. Then I will choose industry somewhere more public, she said, somewhere loud with witnesses. An unwise pull of admiration tugged at him. He severed it with care. He let his gaze drop, as if considering the book on the rail. The margin notes in that neat Latin hand did not belong to her. The paper under her sleeve did. He could see the faint line where its corner pressed against the fabric. He could feel, unhelpfully, the heat radiating from her skin beneath it. It is late, he said. His tone returned to iron. You will be expected at the promenade. And you? I am always expected. Her mouth lifted by less than a breath. You are not always present. He dropped his voice. There are drafts here that do not come from windows. Leave them for men who think they cannot catch cold. You think I cannot catch cold. I think you will not complain if you do. She let that stand. She slid the psalter back into its place as if nothing inside it had been of interest. He stepped aside and gave her the path, turning his shoulder to the pillar to remove his body from her way. She passed him so close he could have counted the breaths between them. He did not turn to watch her go. When she reached the doorway, she paused. The candles reflected in the sheen of the flagstones at her feet. If I am not quiet, she said without looking back, I will need advice. Then advise yourself as I cannot, he answered, precise and cool, because anything warmer would have betrayed them both. He remained after she left, because to follow would write one story and to do nothing would write another. He chose the story that cost him. The chapel gathered itself around him, making his outline part of its geometry. The bells began their small argument with the hour. Dawn was still a rumor. It would arrive with schedules and choreographies and eyes. He ran a hand over his cuff and found it empty of talismans. He made a note in his mind the way a soldier checks a musket by touch. There would be no kindness granted them by the morning. He would have to make do with accuracy. He left the chapel by the side door and took the servant's stair up, because power moves more efficiently when it sees the backs of the people who carry it. A wench with a broom flattened herself against the wall when she saw him. His steps made no sound that the corridor did not fold into its already held breath. Dawn took hold of the east windows like a housekeeper opening shutters. The palace woke. He reached his rooms and found them arranged as if men who did not sleep had stood there all night. Fresh water, fresh linen. The chamberlain placing a document at the exact angle that meant the signature would be clear in the light when he came to it. Etienne crossed to the mantel and read without touching. The document said everything and nothing. Men with small fiefdoms in their chests had prepared projects for his consent while the court had danced. The habit was to lay them before him at hours when his mind was supposed to be tired. His mind was not tired. He dressed for the promenade as if armor had cuffs. His valet, who had learned years ago not to speak unless asked nothing. The prince fastened a cuff and let his sleeve fall. It brushed a small fragment of violet that lay on the console table by the door, a moth's wing of color where there ought to have been none. He paused. The ribbon's edge had frayed under use, as if tied and untied with hands that meant things. He felt it with 2 fingers and closed them. He did not put it in a pocket. He wrapped it around his wrist and drew his cuff over it, a private tourniquet to stop something from bleeding out. The day took its weight. Madeleine had left the chapel and climbed the back stair with the same pace that had taken her into the corridor the night before. The palace had learned her footsteps. They no longer betrayed her by echoing. The Queen's women collected her quietly, rearranged the line of her sleeve and the fall of her hair without comment, and pinned at her bodice a strip of violet she had retrieved from the bedpost before the sun thought to argue with the rooftops. The pin slid home with a firm little bite. The ribbon sat where color does when it means intention. "Hold a fan this way," the senior tutor said, pressing a painted device into her hand. "It will tell them your patience is sublime." "And if it is not?" Madeleine asked. "Then they will suppose it is and punish themselves later for having been fooled." She breathed, counted, stepped into the mirrored gallery at the appointed moment. The court had an appetite for mornings when there had been a wedding the day before. It came hungry, carrying cups and judgments, and found both to hand. A string of courtiers approached her with compliments that grazed. She let them. The tribunal never slept. It only changed its shoes. She felt the ribbon where it lay, a thread of field stitched to a dress that did not know dirt. She let her gaze travel in the mirrors and caught at the far edge the receding line of a sleeve she recognized. The prince moved toward her, the hall obliging by making a path. He reached her, turned just enough to be seen near her, and let their proximity mean obligation. He did not address her beyond what the hall required. She did not ask him to. "You have not tripped," he said, because small mercies could be mistaken for insults if delivered badly. "Not all obstacles are on the floor," she answered, remembering the draft under the chapel door. He left then, and the gap he had occupied filled with faces that wanted to be reassured that his leaving meant nothing at all. The concubine appeared as if the music had summoned her timbre. Her gown was a lesson in restraint that read as provocation to men who thought cloth existed to entertain them. She moved with the sway of someone who had learned to carry injury and not spill it. Her gaze slid past Madeleine without catching. It was tact, performed as self-preservation. Servants shifted. Pages were sent on invented errands that intersected in one particular corridor off the gallery. The gallery's sound drew toward that corridor like water toward a drain. Madeleine felt the court's attention tilt. The Queen's women stiffened as if they had smelled smoke on silk. A small knot of people unspooled themselves toward the side passage where doors opened onto suites that did not belong to the public. Someone who believed himself witty made a low observation that carried. Two ladies in the middle ranks repeated it and gave it weight with their voices. The tutor touched Madeleine's elbow with a pressure that said, "Stay," then said, "Come." Duty required seeing when others pretended not to see. Duty required not fainting. They reached the threshold of the side corridor at the exact instant the wrong door opened. Two figures stood in the doorway. Liane's hair lay like script over one shoulder. Etienne's hand showed pale against the dark wood where he had just dropped it from the latch. They were too close to declare innocence and too far to declare intimacy. It was the distance a painter gives to saints who have shared a thought, but not a touch. A hush pooled. It was not silence. It was the sound of satisfaction threading itself through 100 throats. The concubine's expression did not change. It could not afford to. The prince's did not either. He had trained it not to. A gold spill of light from a high window marked the dust between them, as if to underline the exact inches that courts cannot see. Madeleine stood. The ribbon at her bodice felt heavier. She did not flinch. She did not step back. A whisper passed near her ear that said, "Poor girl," and another that said, "Of course," and a third that said nothing in words, but made itself known in the shape of a mouth. The Queen's women moved. One placed herself at Madeleine's side so that the onlookers would have to take her in as part of the tableau. The tutor's fan opened to the angle that meant, "We are bored by your cruelty." The door closed. The corridor's function resumed. The court rearranged its face around the new information as if it had expected it all along. Madeleine inhaled and let air stay. She had thought once on a hill above her father's vineyard that wind loves the one who will not resist it unto breaking. She chose to bend and then to straighten. By the time she returned to her rooms, a folded paper waited on her valet table. No seal with a lion or a crown. A more modest ring in red wax, stamped neatly. The hand that had addressed it was careful enough to be anonymous. She broke it open. The ink spoke in the polite register of men who like to say ugly things while sounding reasonable. An inquiry had been initiated into irregularities in the transport of barrels from a certain provincial vineyard. Names were not necessary, the geography was sufficient. There would, of course, be no need to involve the Crown should the interested party find a way to remove herself from the kind of scrutiny that often damaged the innocent. The air thinned, not the air in the room, the air around the heart. She sat, because knees are traitors when they remember the weight they carried as children. She read the letter again, syllable by syllable, as if the shape of the words could change their meaning. It did not. It was a threat wrapped in linen and laid at the foot of her bed. She folded it once, cleanly. She placed it beneath the brush where the Queen's women would not find it by accident and gossip it into poison. She stood, and when she stood the ribbon at her bodice tugged as if to anchor her. A sound of bustle swelled outside like a tide. The day pushed her toward the garden as if it were all one theater and every scene had its place. The promenade must be completed. The flowers must be remarked upon. The fountains must be admired. The princess must be seen being seen. The palace did not stop for bruises. She went. The gardens were too formal to be kind. Boxwood hedges cut the sun into obedient strips. Gravel shifted underfoot in a way that sounded expensive. Beyond the main walk lay a maze planned to amuse men who loved to be lost with certainty that someone would find them. The Queen's women kept her to the paths used for display until obligation was checked off its list. Then a courtesy freed her for a turn around the central fountain, where she might compose herself out of the line of people who wished to be the first to wound. She drifted toward the fountain, grateful to be grateful for the incompetence of carp that flared gold and fat under the surface. There was shade here, thrown by cypress, and a statue of a boy with water cupped in his hands. Children would have laughed at the boy. The court smiled at him with their eyes and never remembered him afterward. Footsteps trailed hers, not loud, not soft. 2 sets, attempting to be neither. She turned once and saw no one close enough to cause offense. The press of people had thinned. It was the time of day when letters got written and faces were washed in hope of looking new. Ahead, a narrow path led between hedges toward the fountain proper. She took it. The air cooled. The scents changed. Less perfume, more green. She did not hurry. Hurrying would make a story from nothing. At the bend, a figure appeared. Gloved hands, the tilt of a hat not quite low enough to be deferential and not high enough to be insolent. Another figure paused behind her just beyond the corner of her eye. She granted them no fear to feed on. "I am in need of air," she said to the one who could hear if he wished, in the tone one uses on a footman who has been too eager. "Please afford it to me." No answer. The path confined the 3 of them in a brief, intimate geometry. The fountain's sound sharpened. Falling water does not care about human errands. It simply falls. She moved forward. The figure ahead moved just enough to make the space narrower. The one behind took a step that made his presence wait. "The weather is kind," she said, as if these were gentlemen and the hour harmless. "The weather is what it is," said the man ahead, and the voice was wrong in the way voices are when they have borrowed dialects and failed to return them. She did not turn her head toward the one behind. She saw by the angle of his shadow the exact moment his hand lifted. The push was not violent. It was accurate. Her balance broke. The rim of the fountain caught her calf, and then her knee, and then the air did what it always does, stepped aside. The water took her as if it had been waiting. Silk dragged at her like vines. Her hair, freed by force, spread and pulled. The world became bells and green light. She kicked and met weight, kicked again and met nothing. The lungs, those traitors when one most needs them, burned with a controlled, expanding pain. Her hand flew to her sleeve, to the place where the paper lay. It had already slid, sneaking toward her wrist. She caught it by a corner, then lost it. It loosened and moved away from her, a pale rectangle turning like a leaf. It drifted toward the grate that kept carp from escaping and secrets from returning. She tried for the surface. The surface was farther than she had remembered it being from looking down on it. The dress took all her movements and made them half of what they needed to be. The fountain's lip wobbled above like a coin dropped into wavering water. She saw, through liquid light, a shadow pass along the rim. A second shadow. Both receded. They did not return. Her lungs clenched toward a breath that would not come. A small, precise thought occurred to her. This is a message. It is not a murder. It is a lesson about how close one can be brought. The shade of the statue fell across her face as she turned. The ribbon at her bodice loosened in the water, breathing like a thing alive. It streamed free and then coiled lazily around her arm, as if unwilling to go. Her chest became an integer of pain. Her sight confettied at the edges, then drew to a point so fine it hurt to look at it. Her hand opened, empty. Black crept in with the patience of lacquer, finishing what others had begun. Arms plunged through the green, dragging cold up with them. Etienne's hands closed beneath silk and bone, and lifted. The fountain roared in his ears, hard water and harder blood. Madeleine broke the surface in his grip, head thrown back, mouth open to air that did not come fast enough. "Hold," he said, though he knew she could not hear sense while the lungs argued for breath. He hooked his elbow under her shoulders, turned her toward the rim, and pressed her palms to stone. "Now, breathe." She coughed a blade of water and then another, and then breath came ragged and furious. Her lashes were black with it. He took her weight and hauled, the weight of the gown fighting him, the weight of the court pressing from behind his ribs, with 1,000 eyes. He forced it out of the picture. The world came down to his hands, and the woman between them. 2 servants, late to be useful and early to be witnesses, hurried along the path and stopped with their mouths half open. Etienne cut them with a glance that said, "This did not happen." One fled for a cloak. The other fled because flight was the safer story. "Up," he said. "There." He pulled her under the cypress shadow, away from the line of sight of anyone who loved a tableau. The cloak arrived from nowhere. Everything arrived in this house from nowhere. And he wrapped it around her, as if warmth could be given like a command. Water ran from the hem in a line that pointed to the hedge. It would dry. Judgment dried quickly in sun. "Can you stand?" She nodded once, then again, more truly. Her mouth was pale. She gathered the cloak at the throat the way a woman gathers a last defense. His gaze dropped, unbidden, to the violet ribbon loosening from her bodice. It curved in the air, reached for her wrist, then slid, unwilling to leave, unwilling to stay. He caught it. The silk lay in his palm like a line back to a day when grapes stained instead of politics. He pressed it into her hand. "Keep that," he said. "I intend to," she managed, voice roughened into strength. The garden murmured. The palace watched. He measured the distance to a door meant for gardeners and men with tools. The hinges there were old, but old had its uses. He took her elbow, not as a claim, but as balance, and steered them toward it. "Walk," he said, "as if you are chilled and I am an attentive husband." "Is that the lesson for today?" Her teeth chattered around the words. She put them in order anyway. "It is adequate for this minute." The door yielded to his shoulder. Cool air pooled in the service corridor beyond. The smell of damp stone replaced perfume. He pulled her through and closed the door on the fountain's bright noise. The shadow took them in. She leaned her back against the wall and closed her eyes, as if the dark could press the water out of her. He braced his hands on either side of her shoulders, not touching, making a harbor of his body without letting it declare itself. He breathed, to match hers, lending his rhythm until hers found its own. "I am not hurt," she said, opening her eyes. That was not true. The bruise on her shoulder would bloom. She said it anyway. "You are wet," he said, because it was safer than admitting any other observation. "And you are in danger." Her chin lifted under the cloak. "I have been since the Latin," she said, and left it there. He looked down the corridor, measured it for footsteps, then back to her. "This way." He kept to the passages that ran behind the grand rooms, where the walls were thicker and voices did not carry. A stair climbed, shallow-treaded for men who carried turines. On each landing, he paused, not to listen. He had trained himself out of obvious wariness, but to be certain his caution read as entitlement. He reached a narrow antechamber with a bench scarred by decades of hands and a peep into a room where at noon linen would be counted. "Sit," he said. He wrung a handkerchief and handed it to her. His hands, which had hauled her from water, shook once, then understood themselves again. She touched her hair, the simple gesture of a woman recalibrating the world. "You were there quickly." "I do not walk as slowly as men pretend who wish to be observed," he said, and added, because he could not bear the misreading any longer, "This was not mischance." "No," she said softly. "It was education." Her eyes were too bright for comfort. He wanted to ask how many breaths she had stolen from water and made her own. He did not. He switched to the ground he could claim. "You cannot go back to the garden, and you cannot be seen in this state. Then keep me where I cannot be seen." The calm in her voice hurt. He leaned closer, lowering his tone until the stones could not steal it. "Madeleine, I will prefer clarity to cruelty. I have not given Leon what the court wanted to believe. They have given her to me instead. They use her to pin rumors to my name and to open doors that close against men." She held his gaze until the words settled. Then, only then, "So you are not faithless. You are besieged." "I have been both in other ways," he said, "but not in that one." "Why tell me now?" "Because they will not stop at humiliation. They will remove what does not cooperate." She looked down at the ribbon, now darkened and wrinkled from the fountain. Her thumb moved over it, a tiny oath. "And your remedy?" "Distance," he said first, because that was what he had taught himself to administer. "I would have you away from this for a time. Leave the court until the dance is done." "And leave you to dance alone?" "Do not make me call it prudence," he said, "when it is fear." Her laugh cracked. "Fear is not always unwise. Nor is defiance always brave." She did not argue. She pressed the handkerchief to a new drip that escaped her hair and considered him with the unsentimental attention he had come to crave against his will. "What happens if I stay?" "Then we stop pretending we are not allies," he said, "and we make an end of this." "How?" He exhaled, long, through his nose. The weight he had carried for months shifted. It did not lighten. It settled into place. "By naming the man who believes he cannot be named." "Say his name," she said. "Meercourt," he answered. The First Minister's syllables tasted like iron. She nodded once, as if a ledger entry had balanced. "Then you will need more than my absence to defeat him. We will need a plan," he conceded, "and an hour that belongs to us." A door to his left, flush with paneling, gave a sigh. A woman slipped through, quiet as a confession. Leanne closed the panel behind her and leaned against it only long enough to let herself exist. Composure slid back over her like a glove. She took in the cloak, the wet, the closeness, and did not waste words on commentary. "Someone," she said, "has been generous with their servants." "Timetables," Etienne said. "We are interrupting them." Leanne's eyes went to Madeleine, and then returned to him. "I am sorrier than I can afford to look." "You brought me into this," Madeleine said, not with accusation, but with a plainness that respected the price of plainness. Leanne inclined her head. "I brought myself. They used you." "There is a distinction that does not comfort." "Comfort is not in fashion," Madeleine murmured. Leanne glanced down the passage and then back. There is a folio meant to move tonight. The mask gives cover. It carries decisions you did not make and debts you will be said to have promised. If it moves, the next month arranges itself against you. Who holds it? Etienne asked. An aide you would recognize if I named him, she said, and did not. Names had ears. He will walk at the second hour, between the musician's pause and the queen's second entrance. Etienne's mind sorted the angles, the places where men stood by habit, the habit of a court to watch what it is told to watch and miss what moves under its own feet. He did not need to ask for proof. Proof breathed between them in different forms, the wet cloak, the ribbon, the pressure of a hand at a woman's shoulder that left no visible mark and every possible message. He looked to Madeleine. You decoded what you found. I did. The affirmation was simple. The pattern starts inside public words. It thinks itself clever. It is only consistent. Liane's mouth softened, one heartbeat. He will underestimate you for as long as you permit it. Madeleine lifted her chin. Then let us decide how long that will be. They crowded the bench between them with purpose. Etienne leaned his shoulder to the wall and spoke in a voice that would not wake a sleeping servant on the other side. In the mask we have move and counter-move. We need witness, loud witness. We need proof ordinary eyes can follow. Decryption, Madeleine said, laid out in short, honest steps. I can do that. I can show them how the name appears without knowing I have taught them. And the ledger, Liane added, touching her sleeve where paper had a way of hiding. I can mark the places, the hands, the hours, not with names, with the pattern itself. Where? Etienne asked. Near the musicians, Liane said. They command attention without asking. A dais there becomes a pulpit if one uses it. You will be near the aides, he said, and take from him what he hopes to carry. Or cause him to hesitate, she countered. Hesitation is its own confession if you know how to listen. Madeleine looked between them. And the queen? She must be present, Etienne said. And she must act not for me, but for the crown. It is the only move he cannot argue. Will she? She will if we leave her no honorable path else, he said. She is a mother when she can be, a sovereign when she must. Silence held for a beat, then two. It was not hesitation. It was the counting before a leap. Madeleine drew the cloak tighter and tilted her head in a gesture he had learned meant she was taking pain into herself and using it for fuel. One thing more, she said. A letter came to my rooms. It implies my father has been careless with barrels and laws. Of course it did, Liane said under her breath, all empathy hidden inside derision. Etienne's jaw hardened. We will answer with order, not panic. How? Madeleine asked, not because she doubted, but because she needed chain and link. There is a man whose duty it is to carry papers and not invent them, Etienne said. He will place in the right hands what proves the vineyard's orderliness, not at court, in the city office where ink must answer to paper. You trust him? I trust the system that feeds him, he said. It hungers for accurate records. Then send him, she said, and let me send a bruise. He looked at the place on her shoulder where fabric darkened. A physician, he said, quietly. One who can count without adding, Liane said. Etienne stepped to the small door and signaled with a rap that meant message, not emergency. A young man appeared and gave his attention, as if it had been trained to stand and hold. Etienne spoke softly. The man bowed, took the folded letter and a second folded page taken from a drawer hidden in the paneling, and vanished into the artery of the palace that leads to the city's honest desks. Another messenger went for the physician. He arrived with a box that smelled of herbs and linen. He did not ask questions that would turn into stories. He looked at the shadow forming on Madeleine's shoulder, touched it with fingers that apologized without words, and wrote what he saw in the small hand of his craft. He bound the shoulder lightly and left as he had come, absorbed by stone. Thank you, Madeleine said to the heir he left behind. We will have proof, Etienne said, more to himself than her. Every move accounted. She stood. Water no longer fell from her hem. It lay heavy, but she moved as if weight could be used. "I will not leave," she said, putting an end to that conversation in a way that avoided triumph. "I will stand where I must, and speak, and not shake." He did not pretend to be pleased. He did not scold. He reached for the ribbon in her hand, and before his mind could instruct otherwise, wound it once around his wrist and once around hers, binding them with a knot no bigger than a thumbnail. He held it for one breath. "Together, then," he said. "Together," she echoed, and the word settled like gravity. He released the ribbon and returned it to her palms, closing her fingers over it. Liane watched with the careful gaze of a woman who had not been offered belonging in a long time and knew to look away when it might look like hunger. "Tonight," Liane said, regaining the cold edge that kept her safe, "I will stand where I am expected to stand and move when you do. At the second hour." Etienne nodded. "If you are blocked, I will falter," she said, understanding him perfectly, "and in faltering, draw more eyes than purpose could." He almost smiled. It was not a kindness, it was respect. "We will make their vigilance useful." The hours narrowed toward evening. They did not stop. They did not skip. Men carried candles and replaced them. Women called for fresh laces. Music sought its tuning in a room far away and got it. The palace tightened itself into ritual. Madeleine changed with the help of hands that had learned to button without gossiping. She chose green, not loud, not meek, the particular shade of leaves when they have drunk enough rain. Her hair was arranged to look like thoughtfulness rather than opera. The bruise hid under fabric. A small thunder kept close. She slid the ribbon into a fold at her wrist, not hidden, not announced. She met her own eyes in the mirror and recognized them. Etienne dressed for the masque with precision that had nothing to do with vanity. He chose simplicity where others chose excess, because simplicity made men underestimate. He matched no one's colors and thus matched the room. He secured under his cuff the thread of violet. It rested against his pulse and kept count with it. He did not send word to the queen. There were too many ears in every word. He would give her evidence in a place where audience prevented the usual reshaping of truth. Liane prepared at a dressing table that had seen too many versions of patience. She selected jewels that suggested favor without promising it. She drew breath until breath did not tremble. She lifted her chin at herself and practiced saying nothing in a way that would communicate volumes. Her eyes warmed when she allowed them to, then cooled again. She practiced both. In the passage behind the ballroom, the three of them converged not by design, but by necessity. The wall shook faintly with the testing of drums on the other side. A drift of scent, orange peel, beeswax, stretched velvet, the faint sharpness of wine, reached them through the seams where 100 candles breathed. A footman passed, saw what he had not been trained to see, and kept moving because men like him live longer that way. Etienne looked at Madeleine and found in her what he had told himself not to seek. Not compliance, not defiance. A quality like steadiness at sea. He met Liane's eyes and gave her, without words, the promise she had asked for. Not to be left. Not to be used without guard. She inclined, imperceptible, and took her place beside the panel that would let her slip into the edges of the crowd. "Ready?" he asked, not because readiness changes fate, but because saying it makes choice clearer. "Yes," Madeleine said. "As I will be," Liane said. He reached for the ribbon. For one heartbeat, he tied it again around his wrist and hers, the knot precise, the gesture private and as public as the images in mirrors. He undid it and tucked it back into her sleeve, with a care that set heat to moving in the coldest parts of him. They turned toward the door. The music on the other side swelled, a tide that had been promised and had arrived to claim the room. They stepped forward together into the light and sound of the masque. Music broke over them like light. Madeleine entered the ballroom with the mask in her hand rather than on her face. The room approved of the choice. It thought it had seen every kind of boldness and did not yet understand this kind. Candles lifted along the walls in double ranks. Silk rasped as bodies turned. The heads of violins tilted like birds. She felt the heat of the crowd lift to meet her skin. She kept her step unhurried, the pace of a woman who had been schooled to be observed and had chosen when to begin the lesson. The dais near the musicians rose half a foot from the floor, not high enough to be a throne, high enough to be a signal. She reached it as the players broke their piece for the customary interval. The sudden hush rippled outward. People in masks and feathers and jewels turned their heads because humans are built to look where sound has just stopped. She set the paper on the stand reserved for musicians' notes. The sheet had dried into a new curve. The softened wax in the corner had taken her warmth and kept it. She set beside it the small ledger with the neat, anonymous hand and the careful columns. She rested her fingertips on both until their tremble remembered another use. A murmur pressed from the floor. "Your Highness," a musician ventured, bow arched in the air like a question. "Continue," she said, without looking away from the page. "You will need this pause." She drew a breath that did not tremble, and when she spoke, she pitched her voice to carry without shouting. The lesson hall had taught her how to fill a room without wanting it. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "you are excellent at paying attention when you are invited to watch." Laughter glittered and died. "You are less good at seeing what does not ask you," she continued. "This page did not ask to be seen. It asked to be hidden, which is how I knew it mattered." A ripple. Fans quivered. Masks adjusted, as if better to hear through them. She lifted the cipher page and held it high enough to be indiscreet, low enough to force the front ranks to lean closer. "This looks like numbers," she said. "It is not. That would be too honest. It is a way of saying a name while pretending to say nothing. It borrows what belongs to others. Letters at the start of lines, numbers meant for bread and wine, and rearranges them to serve itself." She turned a ledger so the nearest could see. "This book is the household's memory. Who brought oranges? Who delivered wood? Who was paid for lamp oil? It is the kind of book that tells the truth because lies make kitchens hungry." A murmur of recognition. A court knows the sound of kitchens, even if it never hears them. "When you take the first letter of each entry on the days marked here," she touched the cipher lightly, "and you count by threes, and you collect what you did not write, you make a name out of ordinary business. It thinks itself clever because it has hidden in plain accounts. Cleverness is often only presumption." She wrote on a scrap of clean paper, each letter neat and small, calling them into visibility where they could be read by any man with a face. She wrote the name they had not been allowed to say without perfume. M-I-R-E-C-O-U-R-T. Silence took the room and held it. The first violin's hand dropped by reflex. The bow tip touched the floor like a curtsy to something it could not understand. Madeline lifted the little strip with the letters to where the Queen could see it from across the room without straining. "This pattern recurs," she said. "It recurs in this ledger and in others. In the psalter in the chapel margins. In the notations for audiences conducted off the hours when you like to be noticed. You accuse," a man breathed, not quite loudly enough to claim the courage of it. "I show," she said, and set the cipher and the ledger side by side. "You may accuse yourselves with what you see." A hissed intake of breath. A fan shut, a finger snapped, a whisper of fabric as bodies turned toward the places where power congregated. The Queen Mother's face had sharpened into the line she wore when the state required her, not the family. She lifted her hand without rising, and that small movement rearranged the room. "Bring it," she said to a page who looked younger than his livery. Madeleine did not carry the paper down. Her hands did not shake. She stood, and in standing, drew the center of the room to her, while the boy ran the short distance and presented the pages to the Queen. The boy's steps sounded loud. The hall measured them. From the opposite quadrant, A man in a sober coat threaded the crowd, a velvet folio tucked under his arm. He moved at just the wrong speed to be innocent. He looked for gaps that were not there. He looked for the line of sight that could be interrupted. Etienne moved then, and the room remembered that it had been his since before he had been tall enough to look it in the eye. He cut across the floor as if it had been poured for him, folding the crowd open without touching anyone. He stepped directly into the path of the folio and stopped. No violence, no spectacle. Only the simple physics of a body that would not receive an impact and would not yield. "Your Excellency," the aide said, forgetting himself in his fluster and awarding the prince a lesser title. Her Majesty requires truth," Etienne said, voice low, words clean. "Not traffic." He put out his hand, palm up, a gesture older than any court in Europe. The folio did not move toward it. The aide's fingers tightened imperceptibly. The folio chose the wrong friend. Etienne let the mistake live in air for a single heartbeat, then took the folio, not roughly and not gently, and turned with it toward the throne dais. The Queen Mother raised the cipher strip and the ledger sheet to the candlelight. She did not squint. She did not pretend to be confused. She traced the letters with a finger that had signed treaties and tucked blankets around fevers. She gave the papers to the man behind her with a glance that said, "You will compare this with what we have." He bent, eyes hungry not with scandal, but with relief that numbers might be asked to tell the truth. The First Minister stood 3 paces off, neither shrinking nor advancing. His face made its small adjustment into dignity under duress. It had been trained. It betrayed nothing. "Your Majesty," he said, when it was his time to speak. "The princess is young. The enthusiasm of the newly educated has uncovered your name in my ledgers," the Queen said, cutting neatly. "Which means those ledgers, which belong to me, have been used without me. It is innocent. It is systematic," she said. "Do not mistake my ears for yours." Liane moved along the edge of the crowd with the grace of a ship matching the current. She approached a point directly in the radius of the minister's aides, found the one who breathed as if the folio had been torn from his arm, and paused with her fan half open at the angle that meant, "Speak if you dare." He said nothing. His face said everything required. She stepped into the space below the dais and did what she had not done during an audience in months. She addressed the Queen without looking at the prince first. "Majesty," she said, "if the household's book is a memory, I bring a second memory to match it. Times of entry, times of exit, the places where hidden doors have been used for purposes not meant for them. The nights when the prince's name was spoken without his mouth. It does not tell you everything. It will tell you enough." "You will speak to this room?" the Queen asked. No softness, no hardness, only measure. "I will," Liane said, "if I may do it once and be done." "You may." Liane opened the small booklet she carried. The miniatures of script were spare and lovely, illegible at a distance to those who preferred their guilt in rumors. She read without haste. On the eve of the wedding, an entrance, 2nd hour, door behind the accounting room, a message carried with the auxiliary seal. On the night of St. Bernard, a meeting in the small salon with the purpose of being observed. On the Tuesday after, a note dropped purposely, to be seen by any who wished to put shame where it did not belong. A wave of discomfort, delicate as lace and sharp as wire, moved the crowd. Liane did not cover herself with apology. She stood inside what had been done to her and named what it demanded of the room. "The folio in question will contain endorsements made without consultation," she added. The signature line prepared for a hand that did not hold the quill. The spines of similar books marked with the same seal as that broken on the paper the princess found. The Queen looked from Liane to Etienne to Madeleine and back to the First Minister, as if balancing a table with 3 legs and one well-intentioned stone. Mirecourt inclined his head, the movement small. "Majesty, the appearance of impropriety is the harbor into which the guilty sail when their ship leaks," the Queen said. Her gaze cut to the guard captain, to the man who answered to the crown and not to fashion. Your sword is for silence tonight. Your hands are for paper. Collect what matches this hand. She lifted the cipher, her fingers steady. Secure the archive. No fire. No packing. No leaving. Anyone carrying a folio must show it to you. And send word to the prefect in the city that he is to receive a parcel regarding a vineyard. He will do his part with the documents provided. The guard captain saluted with his eyes. He did not move quickly. He moved correctly. And you, the queen said to Liane, without cruelty, without pity, you have been used. Leave this room with protection. Do not leave the palace until I say so. But know you will not be turned back at a gate when you go. Liane bowed, not deeply, with the dignity a woman has when she has salvaged her name for herself. She stepped back and folded herself into the shadow of the dais, where she would not be looked at unless she wished. The court, deprived of its favorite food, waited to see what would replace it. Etienne stood with the folio in his hand. He could have handed it up and stepped back into the neutral space a man uses when he intends to keep breathing without being cut. He did not step back. He turned instead and climbed the 2 steps to the queen's level. He did it without noise, but the room heard it. "Majesty," he said, "you have acted. I must as well." She angled her head. The line at her mouth softened by a degree. "You are late to the habit of confession." "I have been earlier to the habit of caution," he answered, "and I have learned its limits." 1,000 eyes leaned. He turned to face the room, and then to face the dais, where the musicians' stand held the cipher like a solemnity. The musicians themselves held their instruments as if they were small living things that could be scared. "I have allowed others to use my name because I believed I protected the crown by silence," he said, not loud, and the room made itself out of listening. "I have allowed a woman to be placed beside me and judged for it while I measured what could be borne. I will not do either again." He lifted the folio. The seal gleamed in the light. He snapped it with his thumb and did not rob the act of its drama. The room inhaled. He drew out the papers within and turned them, page by page, for the queen to see and for the crowd to see him seeing. Signatures arranged in rows for a hand that would never touch them. Accounts that reached for money belonging to no one present. The handwriting precise and narrow. "Meyercourt," the queen said, without heaviness, without surprise. "You have stepped where you were not permitted. You will step aside. For now to a room without window or audience. Tomorrow, to a different future from the one you rehearsed." Meyercourt bowed as if it were a preference. 2 guards flanked him, hands empty and ready. He walked between them like a man modeling patience to a difficult child. The pressure around the crowd changed pitch. Some faces warmed, relieved to be allowed to return to admiration of the music. Some cooled, disappointed in the lack of immediate fire. Most hovered between. Etienne descended the 2 steps. He turned toward the dais where Madeleine stood with the ledger and the cipher and the clean scrap, with the letters that had named the man the court had not expected to see named by a peasant's daughter who tied ribbons to bedposts. He felt the band of violet at his wrist pulse with his heart. He crossed the space to her like a man crossing a small but impassable stream. He stopped a pace away. He did not reach. A hall builds meanings into gestures. Too much, and it swallows you. "Your Highness," he said, and even the formality held warmth now. "You have my name. Keep it." She looked at him, and the look contained the garden, and the fountain, and the rope of a hidden ribbon, and the morning in the chapel, and the lesson at the ledger, and the old habit of not disappearing. She held his gaze without fear. "Then do not require me to hand it back within the hour," she said, so softly only the first rank could hear, and the first rank pretended to be deaf. He lifted his hand. The violet ribbon showed. A small confession escaped from linen. He took her right hand, palm open, as if she might withdraw it, and bound their wrists together with a neat, strong knot. He did not bow. He stood with her, wrist to wrist, and let the room understand. "Our business," he said to the Queen, to the room, to the men who had profited from his restraint, "will be conducted in daylight and in partnership." The Queen's fan stirred the air like a decree softened for human use. "So be it," she said. "Musicians, play." The violins found their strings. The tune rose tentative, then strengthened, as if encouraged by the fact of bodies still wanting to move. People rearranged themselves into the shapes demanded by the evening's script. Some could not keep their eyes from the ribbon binding two hands. Some pretended not to see and wore their pretense like a crown. Liane moved then, as if her cue had been written into the floor. She crossed to the side door indicated by a glance from the guard captain and passed through, neither triumphing nor skulking, simply going where safety had been arranged to meet her. A man with calm eyes fell in beside her, with the kind of invisible protection good officers can make when they remember law rather than appetite. The frenetic appetite of the court began to feed again on wine and chatter and the little jealousies that needed smaller stories to grow. The blow had landed. It had been seen to land. The room would not stop. That was not its way. It would shift and make a new balance. Under the sound of fiddle and flute, Madeleine and Etienne stood for a beat longer, wrists bound, and let their breath slow at the same rate. He loosened the knot and did not drop the ribbon. He tucked it back under her cuff, with a care that reflected the measure he intended to use in the rest of his life. "May I escort you from the noise?" he asked. "Only if I am not mistaken for a conquest," she said. "You will be mistaken for instruction," he answered, "which will be new for them." They left the dais without flourish. The path to the orangery was a corridor of shadow threaded with music. A door opened for them, then closed, and the world narrowed to glass, citrus, and the smell of damp soil that has not been asked to be anything except itself. Heat lived in the room, a softer warmth than the ballroom's blaze. Lanterns lit the leaves from below. Oranges, not yet ripe, glowed with the meek promise of future sweetness. Vines traced the trellis along the southern wall, reaching for what they always reached for without impatience. A pieced wooden table held the detritus of gardeners' practical dreams: twine, shears, a cup with a chip, a heel of bread left by someone who had meant to return. Etienne set the folio there, away from water and knives. He looked around as if measuring where a man could put hunger down, and found no better place than where he stood. Madeleine stepped closer to the glass. Condensation made halos under her breath. "It smells like work in here," she said, not unkindly. "It does," he said. He came to stand beside her, not touching. "I should have brought you here first." "You brought me anyway," she said. "First is a matter of angle." He turned to her fully. The line of his body changed. The room, empty of eyes, did not require the old posture. "I am sorry," he said quietly, "for the sentence I chose last night instead of another." She let the words sit between them long enough to be true. "I know what you thought you prevented by saying it. I do not forgive myself for the form," he said, "but I ask you to let me choose another sentence now." "Choose well," she murmured. "I listen." "I do not want a wife who is quiet enough to leave me safe," he said. "I want a partner who will force me to be brave where I have been careful too long." Her breath hitched, small, almost incidental, and entirely new. She tilted her head, as if he had just offered her a cutting from a vine she meant to take and root. "And what do I get for the indignity of tutoring a prince?" "My name," he said. "My word. A house where the doors are not locked by your silence. And if I demand that you be known to me as a man, and not an heir, then you will have to suffer with me while I learn to come in from the edges," he said. "And I will suffer happily." She looked at his mouth and then at his eyes, and then at the ribbon that lay coiled like a question between them. "Teach me how not to be erased," she said. "I will," he said, meaning it. "And you will teach me how not to erase." They stood close enough for their breath to share a shape. The heat in the orangery did what heat does, reminded skin that it exists. He reached for the bread and broke it, the simple sacrament of any house not too proud to admit hunger. He handed her a piece and took one and ate and did not rush. He uncorked the small bottle that had been left for morning men and poured wine the color of last autumn's sunset into cups that did not match. She drank. It tasted like home to her, and like promise to him. She wiped a crumb from her lip with her thumb, and saw his eyes follow the movement, and felt her own flush answer without shame. "You are staring," she said softly. "I am catching up," he said. "Do you intend that to sound like flattery?" "Yes," he said, with that sudden dryness that made his humor feel like a door he opened for only a few. "And like warning." She set her cup down carefully. "If you intend to warn me of yourself, you are late." He set his beside it. He lifted his hand toward her face and paused an inch away. "I will always stop if you ask me to," he said. "I know," she said, and covered the last inch herself. The kiss was not a conquest. It was not a ceremony. It was an answer. It gathered what had been frayed and knotted it, not tight, but secure. The warmth of the room and the cool of the glass and the human heat of breath and the clean taste of wine and bread braided themselves into a thing that did not require an audience. He drew back just enough to see her properly, as if the old habit of distance had been given a new job. She slid the ribbon from her wrist and looped it over both their hands, not binding, resting. He looked down at the violet and back up at the woman who had brought it here from a field that had no use for palaces. "What does it mean now?" he asked. "That when they say my name, they will have to say yours," she said. "And when they use your name, they will have to think of mine. And when they try to shame you, they will have to shame me," he said, "which they will find inconvenient. Which is why we will make them busy with other matters," she said. They laughed, quiet but real. A bee blundered against the glass and found its way up to the vent and out, as if to prove escape was not always a fantasy. Beyond the panes, a grey seam formed along the roof lines. Dawn rehearsed at the horizon, undecided, then committed. They sat at the table with the gardener's things. He traced the grain with his finger. She watched the vine's smallest tendril find its way to a wire and curl. They did not fill the air to prove they had things to say. They let silence be part of their understanding. "Will you regret this?" she asked at last, the quiet directness that made him trust her more. "Only that I learned too slowly," he said. "I will not regret choosing you where I had been instructed to choose discretion. And I will not regret believing you when it would have been stylish to doubt," she said. He nodded, solemn for a breath. "We will bear the style of being unfashionable." "Which is the first fashion?" she said, smiling. At the east glass, light shifted from pewter to pearl. The oranges became small suns with patience. The vine unfurled another quarter-inch. Inside, a prince and a vintner's daughter invented a way to hold hands in a house that had always preferred to hold people instead. He picked up the ribbon and looped it once around her wrist and once around his, a gesture done with the careful reverence of a man who had abused ritual and meant to repair it. He tied a knot no bigger than a seed. It held with just the right amount of give. "Not a binding," he said. "A reminder," she finished. They stood. He lifted the folio again, not because he wanted to, but because he knew who he was. She lifted the empty cups, not because she needed to, but because she liked the feel of work in her hand. They faced the door that led back into the palace and into the day that would spend itself on what had been started here. They did not dread it. "Walk with me," he said. "I already am," she answered. He smiled, not measured, not lessened. He opened the door. Morning walked in. They crossed the threshold together, the ribbon soft between their wrists, the scent of wine and citrus and new green following them like a promise. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.